And our next speaker is Mr. David Díaz, Deputy Scientific Director working at IEO, the Spanish Institute for Oceanography. So, Mr. Díaz, the floor is yours, and I know you have a presentation on how can IEO as well contribute to the implementation of, to the creation of OECMs.
Thank you so much. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank Javier and Cepesca the interest inviting us in this forum that I believe I feel a bit like everyone who read medical extract that we are the recipient between the Ministry of Environment, MAPA, the fishery organizations, involved sectors, and that's something that I never knew when I was reading medicines. I exactly didn't know, but I believe that's what we are. So I'm going to try to join all of this to amalgamate all the different certificates because we have a really important role. So I'm going to try and explain this important role that we have in this case that it was mentioned in previous presentations on the framework of this new challenge that are OECMs. I'm going to give you a really brief introduction on why, as I'm close to last, you explain most of it, but we are on a moment where for many decades the increase of human activities in marine ecosystems was, okay, sorry about that. I thought this had a laser pointer, but I don't have it because it's a screen. So many different kinds of activities to a use sometimes unknown, and other times seeing that that use was damaging and to change the ecosystem and the dynamics until a few decades ago we started having and stopping this and having all these figures that we were talking about. Among the increase of activity and human pressure from the fishing always existed. Aristotle's already talked about in the books how to fish many of the species. Greek and Roman knew that many of these species appear because these come from far away, but there are many others that are also changing. Obviously, fishing is a really important part, and the important part is the one where many of the figures of preservation were regarding measures in this sector on which, fortunately, we are still not on a non-return point. We have not gone through that point because we understand that if we stop fishing and we stop doing some activities, then we expect that recovers, and we're seeing with all the studies on marine reserves and protected areas to see this efficiency, because the important word of what we're talking about today of all the measures, effective measures, effective is kind of the key word of this concept. And this concept could be effective because we have not get to this non-return point of no return. So we're still in time to be able to act. Obviously, a management without knowing what we have, a blind management, is not useful. We cannot start harvest a field and getting goats and so on. This is the same. We don't know what we have, and it's important basis that contributes with from different entities. But basically, many of these, a lot of this knowledge comes from science, from scientists, from knowing the distribution of a species, the seabed, morphology, bathymetry. So sea is spanned in less than 1,000 meters because there's a map of the seabed and we know where that is. So it's not something out of the blue. So we're in a moment, what we call now the era of Anthropocene, that we're seeing talking what we saw now, and the difference is that the tax of the changes that happen is really fast. Unfortunately, We have to differentiate that we look a lot more to the ocean, but since I started scuba diving in 1989, 1990, I've seen on my short life of what would be the life of Earth, also new species that came up, species that disappeared. I've seen cycles of many species change. The one reproducing in May now reproduce in August. The different species that I didn't see in September are all the way to December. And the problem is the rate of change, the speed at which these changes occur, and that's important. We need to include and to solve this. How do we do that? With long-term monitoring, which is something that OECMs identify. Let's have some long-term monitoring. Let's have some monitoring programs so we can see this. I always explain that my thesis was on red lobster, and if my thesis would have been of 3-year ones, my conclusions would have been 1. My thesis was took 10 years, so I had different conclusions.
I would have been able to submit 2 conclusions depending on the deadline of my thesis, but the reality was completely different. And the more I look at a topic, the more these conclusions differ. There was a peak of abundance of our lobster stock. After 10 years, you reach a different conclusion because there are variations in stocks. I think that if I had just studied 1 year, I would have concluded, hey, the extinction of lobsters in a matter of a year. So my end-of-degree tutor told me, study some more years, come on. Anyway, I just wanted to convey how the timeline of our research determines our findings. We need to look for tools to solve or to maintain the integrity of our marine ecosystems, which you can see on the screen. I think that Jorge or Pilar have already shared the PMAs in Spain, this map where we establish these conservation areas based on protection of habitats, species, and regulation of pressures in specific areas. Now, these concepts are all collected by the term OECM. OECM defines an area, what needs to be conserved, and they force you, so to speak, for conservation or the effect of conservation to be sustained and long-term. So OECDs actually collect many of these factors. It's a very confusing domain for many. Many are duplicating efforts. We give the same thing 50 different names: national park, regulated area, natural reserve, no-take zone, special protective zone, FRA, national park. What are we doing? Are we doing the same thing as an area for diving, for conservation? At the end of the day, it depends on who's declaring, who's reporting these areas. That's what determines the name, whether it comes from an NGO or the government. But we're duplicating efforts, and it leads to a lot of confusion. And in the long term, we should, at least this is my proposal off script, I think we should limit the number of names. It's what I call the prostitution of names. People don't understand that when you go to a place and it's called marine reserve, maybe you can fish, and in a national park you can carry out certain activities, and they ask you, but isn't this a national park? Well, national park, that's not what it means even. It has nothing to do with fishing, for instance. So there's a lot of confusion as to the human activities and the names. As Pilar was saying, it's important to disseminate what these names mean. People need to understand these terms and recognize what they can or cannot do here, to legitimize these spaces for people to understand that we are doing interesting things for conservation. Let's limit the number of names because people get confused. I always put the example of my dad. I ask my dad, what would you understand if you heard marine reserve? I suppose this is a national park and I can't do anything. That doesn't mean necessarily that you can't do anything. Maybe you can hunt in a national park. It's confusing. It's confusing for the population. Basically, part of the objective is for all of these measures to matter, to have a tangible outcome. The umbrella of all of these terms need to contribute to the 30 by 30 target. If we analyze the different definitions of marine reserve, marine protected area, the objectives or the definitions in different manuals, we can contribute to the 30 by 30 goal. Why are we working on this or considering all of this? Because we are not far from the reality. We are not far from a reality where we can meet the goal. This is one of the concepts in which, or at least if you ask me, this is one of the concepts that is most difficult to articulate within legislation, when applicable, when it is done. For instance, this is a picture here of San Fernando, of the Campo Soto beach. I don't remember the name. You can see this poster, firing range or shooting range. This is a marine reserve. It's an OECM. Nothing is done there. It's a no-take zone because there is a firing range, a shooting area, and that's why nobody goes there. Now, why is nobody questioning that this is a marine reserve because we are not doing anything there? Isn't this fascinating? How the definition of what OECMs can vary. I don't know if this is in the Bahamas. There are some statues underwater. It's not a sanctuary. It's not used for fishing. There's a boat. People dive. But this is in the middle of the sea. Can this be an OECM? I mean, these conservation measures, this space is not polluting. Can we consider that this is contributing conservation? Should we sink ships to conserve? Obviously not. I'm exaggerating, but at the end of the day, it's about not carrying out human activities. And this is what determines what an OECM is. Well, that's why it's so important to establish the steps to select an area that might be decided as an OECM. Candidate areas need to comply with the criteria that were mentioned before, and that's the way to get started. Now I'll get to the key topic of my speech, which is where can the IOE intervene, the Spanish Oceanography Institute. When we look at different areas and we zones and we screen them against the criteria, we apply the criteria for OECM. We collect all of this information based on the definition of OECM. We monitor, we follow up, we guarantee that there's a positive outcome, we guarantee that we can do a follow-up, we adapt. Each one of these are the main steps where we need scientific research. Scientists are fundamental to validate our OECM-related decisions. The San Fernando beach is not a marine reserve. Nobody knows what's happening there. Nobody's looking at this area. Nobody knows anything. Is this a good thing that nobody's stepping on this beach? Nobody's doing anything about it. But any MPA, any marine reserve should have monitoring, follow-up, and control of activities and control of pressure on the environment. And this is what makes the difference between PMA or OECM. The institute, I'm going to spam you with propaganda about my institute, but when we look at the widespread geographic distribution of ecosystems in Spain, I mean, if we need to protect the pelagic areas, We'd look at the geomorphological shapes, and we can respond to all types of PMAs in the same way as with our capacities to research from the fishery sector. We analyze the pressures put by the fisheries, the part that is regulated by the Ministry of Fishing, and many other activities that have to do with conservation of species, protected species, habitats. There are so many activities. This is the perfect combination behind PMAs, OECMs, apart from the capacity to coordinate campaigns through the Spanish research fleet. On the screen, you can see the Spanish research fleet that we use to cover all our needs. Not only are we working in the coasts, as per the map that we have shown, but there are many different areas that are way offshore. How do we contribute to the establishment of OECMs? We establish what is called a 0 point. We need to prove that something is working. Working with regards to vis-a-vis what? I was being asked by an ESIC director, will you always talk about what's working with your institute? What are you basing your decisions on? Well, because we've been working in the seas. We've been working on the seas for 100 years. We have a comprehensive knowledge in our institute with regards to what is underwater, how our fleet works, and that's why we need to establish 0 points. There are many 0 points, as mentioned before, and the way we fish today is not how we used to fish 100 years ago. How can the IEO contribute to the establishment of OECMs? With the evaluation of pressures. We also propose technical measures. If I carry out a technical measure, this reduces pressure. This contributes to conservation and the cycles of species. A temporary measure can be considered. Can a temporary measure be considered a conservation measure? Well, it depends. If a short-term measure, imagine that you're only fishing for 3 months where a species is not active and in low numbers, and you reduce fishing pressure, it is compatible, but you really need to analyze every case, every ban, every restriction that has to do with the changes of cycles. For instance, my administrative work doesn't allow me to publish something that I'd like to spoil. The red lobster in Spain has changed its cycle. The current ban, the current restriction is not adapted to the new cycle. Spawning would start in June to August before, and therefore there was a ban on a restriction on fishing during the spawning period. But now it can be catched. The measures as to when you can catch or not catch the red lobster. I mean, we haven't adapted it to the new cycle, so it's no longer effective. We are catching 1-2% of the 50% that we used to fish before. There's an increase of catches sometimes. So people say, oh, fishing is going fantastically. No, it's the fact that the cycles are changing, and we need to adapt to the cycles of our fishing species. Now, we also have follow-up programs that are fundamental, and indicators. Indicators to assess conservation are crucial when we declare a zone as a special conservation zone or effective conservation zone. We need to look at the results and the performance per species with benchmarks. How's this area, this PMA, doing with regards to other areas? We need to play with indicators and metrics to carry out an effective assessment. We need to advise to adapt the activities, to adapt the rules and spatial regulations of OECMs. We need to look at outcomes, revisions of the plan. I mean, this was explained before. I copied Silvia's presentation in a previous conference. I've more or less adapted it, highlighting what is under the competence of the Spanish Oceanography Institute. What's most important to me is this cell here. Budget to evaluate, to assess and manage OECMs. We understand that the Spanish government needs to allocate budgetary resources. We are forced to constantly review OECMs to check the effectiveness of these measures, and this needs financial resources. If we have no budget, it simply cannot work. I don't know who has to allocate this budget, but I insist we need money if we want to comply with the measures that have to do with OECMs. Basically, I think that OECMs should definitely contribute to reaching the 30 by 30 goal in the future. As I was saying at the beginning, there's so many different names, terminology, types of regulations of areas, and it really depends on who's given the name. Some are more effective, some others, and we are duplicating many efforts, many resources. We need to think about our window of opportunity. There are windows of opportunity that, for a reason or the other or another, might lead to the lack of fishing. There might be a law in a specific place saying, well, this is protected. There's a volcano has appeared and there's a new habitat established. Anyway, there are many windows of opportunity to establish OECMs. Let's start analyzing these. This is contributing to conservation as much as any PMA. That is my point of view. Thank you very much for your attention.